Next item is a motion on the agenda by Councillor Burgess, or noted as Councillor Burgess, on rent pressure zone. A Conservative amendment has been circulated. I understand Councillor Ray may now want to move this. Councillor Burgess? Yes.
Sorry, Lord Provost, if it's acceptable, my colleague Councillor Ray will speak to the motion.
Fine. Councillor Ray? There's a Conservative amendment to this, so it's up to the mover.
Yeah, Lord Provost, I'm unable to accept the Conservative amendment to this motion. Firstly, it wholly replaces the original motion, which I find unnecessary. Secondly, the amendment makes the case for rent pressure zones conditional. It then becomes a question of if and not how. Frankly, if rent pressure zones are not suitable for the City of Edinburgh, then I really am not clear as to where they are suitable. Therefore, Lord Provost, I'd like to press my original motion.
Okay. Is this a seconder? I congratulate Councillor Ray on her maiden contribution to this chamber. Well done. Councillor Rose.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Provost. Thank you for your comments, Councillor Ray, in relation to this.
Does the proposer not get to speak to the motion?
She's just made it.
I think she spoke just to not accept the Conservative amendment.
If Councillor Ray has further comments to make on the motion, given that it's her maiden speech in this area, I'm minded to allow that.
Thank you, Lord Provost. As we've heard today, the country and the city is facing a crisis in housing. The great right to buy bonanza, combined with the boom in the buy-to-let trend, amongst other factors, has led to a depletion in the social housing stock. This has left many dependent on private landlords and struggling to afford that very basic and fundamental human right of having a roof over their head. Our city has the largest private rented sector in Scotland, and it's the most expensive private rented sector in Scotland. Edinburgh needs action on private rents, and this is why I'm very proud to propose this as the first motion in Council. A report to the Health and Social Care Committee in the autumn last year showed that the average rent was just under £1,000 per month. That's a rise of 31% in 6 years. 31% in 6 years at a time when inflation measured by the Consumer Price Index was 12.6% over the same period. Private rents in the city have risen almost twice as fast in Edinburgh than they have for Scotland as a whole. Many young people and families have been completely priced out of the housing market by private landlords, a percentage of whom have now chosen the lucrative Airbnb market over provision of even limited tenure, pushing private rents even higher. Meanwhile, industry analysts are filling business pages with speculation on even greater returns ahead. 31% rise in income at a time when many of us have seen our incomes flatline, freeze or fall. Add to that the capital gains from property values rising after the crash of 2008. If you're a landlord in Edinburgh now, what a time to be alive. However, if you're a tenant in Edinburgh, you face a huge rise in costs and no rise in quality. To know that the bulk of your income will line a landlord's pockets, leaving you no hope of saving for that vital deposit. To know that losing your livelihood can mean losing your home. To know that losing everything, your income, unless your income is in the higher bracket, such as the barrier to owning or renting your home, then this city does not want you to make your home permanently here. Lord Provost, this is why Edinburgh needs action on private rents. The rent pressure zone powers are a very, very modest step in the right direction to curb rent rises and begin to redress the balance between landlords and tenants. Lord Provost, I move the motion in my name.
Just to confirm the seconder. Councillor Rose.
Thanks, Lord Provost. Take two. I thank and congratulate Councillor Ray on her excellent speech. And I would first of all, it's almost an apology, in that you made the point at the beginning that my motion kind of replaces your motion. And to some extent it did, but that was my attempt just to tidy up the wording of it and make it a sharper wording. In fact, my motion is really just an addendum, effectively, to the intent of Councillor Ray's motion. And the reason for the addendum, the reason for the additional part of it, I'll explain in a moment. But the reality is that actually we broadly want the same thing here. And indeed, as the Leader of the Council said earlier, we want to see rent pressures reduce. We broadly want to see lower costs for housing for the people that Councillor Ray has been talking about and throughout the private rented sector. So, you know, in terms of where we're going or where we want to go, there is, I suspect, complete agreement across the chamber here. However, there is an assumption in the motion that's tabled that a citywide rent pressure zone will inevitably and obviously and absolutely be a good thing. Well, it may be, and I'm not setting my face, we are not completely against some sort of intervention, appropriate intervention. But it does seem to me to be appropriate that we make some attempt. You can't predict the future, but we make some attempt to assess the benefits and disbenefits of whatever is brought in. And it seems to me that that is what is missing from the motion that Councillor Ray has put forward here. You see, it's important that we have an evidence-based policy as best we can by looking forward to any potential pitfalls that there are. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the middle of the 20th century, over a 40-year period, the private rented sector fell in the UK from 55% to 8%. And that was during a period of private rent controls on private rented properties. Now, I think what we have to do here is just look for the unintended consequences, because we all want to ensure that there is more rented property available, there is more housing available, and we know, as Councillor Ray has said, that there is a huge demand for housing in Edinburgh. And so we need to look at the demand and the supply of that demand. And we've talked already today about the supply of more housing in Edinburgh and affordable housing in Edinburgh. And again, the Council Leader made reference to that earlier on. But sometimes what you expect to happen won't happen if you bring in a policy. The Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, for example, had interesting predictions of how much of a tax take there would be from that. And although to some extent it's early days for that yet, there has been a very, very substantial shortfall, as we know, from those expectations and predictions in what has been the take for it. So we have to look at what the impact will be on the market. I am conscious that a similar measure to what is proposed by Councillor Ray has been introduced December 2016, I think the legislation was completed in Dublin and parts of the Irish Republic. But I note there that they were very selective in which areas, and it wasn't just a blanket rent pressure zone, they called it something else, which they introduced there. And of course it's too early to see what the impact is there. And of course I accept that the impact there might not be quite the same as the impact here. Which is why I think it is important, in the terms of the amendment which I am speaking to, that we make some attempt to assess not just the desirability but the anticipated impacts of such a pressure zone, such a policy, on the people that we are all trying to help. And in these terms, Lord Provost, I move my amendment.
Seconder?
Formal second, Lord Provost.
Thank you. Are there any members wishing to contribute? Oh, Councillor Kate Campbell.
Thank you, Lord Provost. Colleagues, every person in our city deserves to have a home that is safe and secure, with a sustainable tenancy that they can afford. To build a life, to put down roots, to contribute to society, for children to be able to learn, all of these things depend on people having a secure home that they know they can return to every night. Housing is one of the biggest issues. I say one because there are a few, but without doubt, housing is one of the biggest challenges that this administration faces. As we've heard from the deputations today, the Westminster-imposed cuts are causing devastation to households across the city. We can see that the cruel reforms to the welfare system, from the benefits cap, universal credits, punitive medical assessments, and the obscene rules around tax credits, are putting more and more people in danger of losing their homes. Add to this stagnant wages, insecure zero-hour contracts, and we know that more and more people's tenancies are at risk. And when people become homeless, we then, as a council, have a duty to house them, and we should. But every week, around 8,000 people are bidding on roughly 30 to 50 social homes in Edinburgh. We see visible homelessness in our city daily, and there are many more people who are not on the streets but who are homeless. They're living in insecure temporary accommodation, which costs the council far more than permanent accommodation, or sleeping on sofas of their friends and family. And the average time that a person who's presented as homeless and been awarded silver priority has to wait to be rehoused, 9 to 12 months. That's 9 to 12 months on the sofa or in a B&B without access to a kitchen or a washing machine. We have made progress. The SNP Scottish Government have stopped the selling off of council homes by putting an end to right to buy. They've also made a commitment to build 50,000 affordable homes, and this coalition has committed to building 20,000 of them here in Edinburgh. But these homes will not be built overnight, and as they are being built, the need for them will be increasing. We have to look at different ways to ease the enormous pressures being placed on social and affordable housing. It seems obvious that one way to do this is to improve the sustainability and the affordability of tenancies in the private rented sector. This is a sector which has seen huge returns on investment, both in the value of property and in increasingly high rents. Research by the Resolution Foundation shows that across the UK between 2003 and 2015, people living in the private rented sector have seen their income rise by just 2%, while their housing costs have risen by around 16%. We've had reports that rents in Edinburgh could be set to rise by a further 20% over the next 5 years. This is unsustainable. We have people working, providing vital public services, nurses, firefighters, teachers, who are forced to move out of the city and away from the communities they serve in order to be able to afford a family home. On its own, a rent pressure zone will not be the solution, but it will enable us to make progress, and we must make progress. We cannot allow Edinburgh to become a city that only the wealthy can afford to live in, and we must stop the increasing pressure on social housing. Colleagues, I commend this motion.
Can I congratulate Councillor Campbell on her maiden contribution to this chamber? Well done. Councillor Cameron.
Thank you, Lord Provost. I received a little bit of teasing this morning as I came in due to the fact I'd met some of the X Factor judges yesterday. But what has struck me in this last 24 hours that we really are living in two Edinburghs, it would seem, given the deputations we've had this morning. And in my own ward, I was astonished that a former council house can achieve a rental of £1,200 a month. It's just staggering. I would like to respectfully suggest to both parties who have got the motion and the amendment that the coalition, in our agreement, and what we would like to do is simply explore the introduction of fair rent zones, and within that we could encompass the concerns and the points that are raised by both the Greens and the Conservatives, if you're minded to be consensual with us and work with us on that, if that would be helpful. It's just a suggestion. Thank you, Lord Provost.
Thank you. Councillor Munro.
Thanks, Lord Provost. I didn't intend speaking in this debate until I heard Councillor Rose speak. And as somebody who's a climate change denier, as Councillor Rose is, he's also in denial of the facts that are presented by the motion that are put before us today. 29% of all housing in this city is owned by the private landlord, some of whom are in this chamber today, by the way. That's more than the council and housing associations put together. More than the council and housing associations put together. We have got a waiting list of over 25,000 people on the council housing waiting list. We've got a council housing stock of under 20,000. So therefore we've got a problem. In the private rented sector, we have got an average private sector rent of £975 per calendar month. £975 per calendar month. Within, and this is where it's difficult for us as a council and it's difficult for the Scottish Government, is that successive Scottish governments have actually undersupplied housing revenue account funding to the City of Edinburgh. If you have a look in the unaudited accounts that are before us in the papers that we have today, we have 41 million. That's half of what Glasgow's got. Glasgow has a housing surplus. We have a housing shortage. We need more funding. But if you actually analyse the housing funding for Scotland as a whole, the Scottish budget, and this has again been in successive Scottish governments, is only 5% of the Scottish Government budget for housing. And yet, urban or rural, it is the need that we have in this country for our people. Yeah, Cameron, you're right. There are consequences. There are consequences for the landlord. There's a drop in profit, maybe, if we do the rent pressure zone. But it's still a profit nonetheless. Still a profit nonetheless. But we can see what the landlord response in this city is. We've seen it this morning with the deputation. Do we want to continue to have further deputations coming to us, being chucked out by landlords because they're still prioritising their income stream rather than actually their tenants? And I think that is why we need to support the motion before us and reject the amendment from the Conservatives. Thank you.
Councillor Aldridge.
Thanks very much, Lord Provost. I'm not a climate change denier, but I do think Councillor Rose had a point on his amendment. I'm actually sorry that Councillor Ray, with her excellent maiden speech, did a really good analysis of the problems that we face in the private rented sector in Edinburgh, and I think all parties agree with that analysis. One of the problems that I think we do face, though, is that there's a lot of change going on in the private rented sector at the moment. The Scottish Government has just introduced new legislation. There will be a new tenancy agreement in the private rented sector, which may affect the supply of private rented accommodation, particularly to people who are vulnerable and who we are hoping will be housed in that private rented sector. We are faced with a restricted supply and an ever-restricting supply of private rented accommodation, and we need to find a proper means to address that. Now, I think you're probably right that a rent pressure zone is part of that solution, but I think we need a much broader strategy of engaging with landlords to ensure that they are accepting vulnerable people, to make sure that rents are at a reasonable level. I'm concerned that the rent pressure zone option has not really been tested yet, and that there may well be unintended consequences, because as I understand it, a rent pressure zone lasts for a limited period, and at the end of that period you end up with rents suddenly bumping up by quite a substantial amount, which could have, if you like, a much more dramatically bad effect on the people that we are trying to help. So I very much share your analysis. I want to get to the same place you're getting to. I think probably that rent pressure zones are part of the answer, but I would rather have a considered report before us, which not only looks at how you go about a rent pressure zone, but actually what the implications are and whether there are any negative unintended consequences before we take the step to doing it. Thanks very much.
I have no other names for elected members wishing to make a contribution. Just doing a final check, in which case I'll ask Councillor Ray if she wishes to give a right of reply.
Lord Provost, in summing up, I don't think there's any point in repeating what I said earlier. The motion that I've called for has asked for a very modest new power to tackle rent rises. I'm disappointed that the Conservatives and the Liberals don't feel that they can bring themselves to accept a very simple and common sense approach to that. It has been proved that limiting rent rises doesn't discourage investment. The new powers do actually allow for rent rises, and they also allow for significant improvements and have encouraged them. Regulation of rents and any other aspects of renting doesn't actually stifle the supply of homes. In fact, it's quite the reverse. And for anybody that says or feels that curbing rents results in a loss of homes, if during the summer recess you feel like a little trip, have a turn around Germany and see where private renting has controls that are way bigger and way beyond anything we have ever in this country seen, and yet they have a bigger, a larger and a much healthier housing market and a much better high-quality rented sector than we've ever seen in this country, and it works exceptionally well there and in many other European countries. So I do hope that the Council can send the right message to the people of this city and the right signal to the private tenants that we will support them and that we will do the right thing by them here. Thank you.
The division bell will now be rung and the vote will be in 1 minute.